So let me start with welcoming all of you here. I will start with a short introduction of who we are and what is coming up. My name is Kata Endrefi. I'm an Egyptologist, and I'm currently teaching at Tutankhamun University in Budapest. And I also have some background working at a museum, but currently I am mostly active at the Palladium that this event is organized by. The Palladium is a civil association which unites Egyptologists, philologists, classical archaeologists, and museum educators. And we focus on classical antiquity in our research, but we also aim to bring these ancient cultures closer to the wider public through various means and activities. If you check our website, it is mostly in Hungarian, but some parts of it are in English. You will see that it is basically a virtual gallery that takes ancient artifacts from museums around the world, and we present them in the context of literature, art, and music, and trying to open them up for contemporary reflections and perspectives. And today's event is a first for us too in making this live, because we have invited Sara Sallam for an online screening of her short film, which is entitled I Prayed for the Resin Not to Melt. And Sara will give a presentation of her work, and then we will watch the film together, and we hope to have a discussion afterwards in which everyone is invited to join. And my fellow host in the discussion will be Kata Yashte, who is also an Egyptologist. She's also a lecturer at Tutankhamun University. She's also a cultural anthropologist, and she conducts fieldwork in Egypt as a member of the Hungarian archaeological mission in Thebes. But most importantly, I would like to introduce our guest, Sara Sallam. Sara is an Egyptian artist who lives in the Netherlands. She works in photography and film, but she's also a designer, writer, visual researcher, and educator, even a bookmaker, I can say. And her work reflects on her Egyptian heritage, and she formulates alternative readings to well-known archaeological narratives by shifting perspectives and even senses, as we will shortly see. But I think we are much better off if Sara introduces her own work. So I will give the floor over to you, Sara, and welcome.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kata, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be invited by the Palladium. I think it's nice to talk about something that a lot of people are currently discussing with the centenary of the Tutankhamun's tomb discovery last year. So there has been a lot of events already addressing this discovery, and I'm happy to continue this conversation, reflecting critically on it and thinking together on how can we take a different perspective or have a different perspective on the past. So today the presentation that I prepared, and before showing the film, I prayed for the resin not to melt, has to do with how this work is, like the origin story kind of this work, but it's also my way of reflecting on the title of the event, listening to Tutankhamun. Particularly listening as a neglected sense, especially in the world that we currently live in, with a lot of saturation of images everywhere. We are exposed to representations, and maybe even these are mediated visual experiences, but the way that we navigate the world seems to be with our faculty of sight at the center. So I think before thinking about listening, I'm interested in questioning this desire to see, And this desire really mirrors the way that our modern world revolves itself around scientific development and wanting to learn about the past, and this notion of process and progress, is really makes seeing and knowing very synonymous. And if we think about archaeological work, and the act of excavating itself becomes really a manifestation of how the act of seeing can be also very invasive, to actually to fulfill the need for knowledge. One needs to literally unearth layers of sand, of mud, of the past, in order to gain access, in order to see and therefore know how the ancient ancestors lived and behaved, and their knowledge. So in a way, listening to me as an artist who works primarily with photography is a way that is a way out of this violence in seeing, this violence in representation. So I often explore listening as a way of imagining different worlds, as a way of empathically relate or sense others. So it's a way of paying attention, right, to the surroundings, and to especially to a world that is really geared towards this dry notion of observing, measuring, and studying in order to gain privilege in knowing. So I would like to share my screen. My mouse is away. I hope everyone can see my screen now. Yeah. So before moving to the faculty of listening, or the sense of listening, I'm gonna start a bit with the act of seeing, with this image, an engraving from around 1891, that depicts one of the very first act of photographing ancient Egyptian human remains. In this image, we see an archaeologist slash museum curator slash photographer in the process of photographing a coffin. The image itself is actually called Photograph of a Mummy, which already in itself hints at how a mummified body in this context could be yet another coffin to be photographed, another artifact to be photographed. And this setup of this image, it's in this modern institution, the museum, as a space for knowledge, and the photographer, the scientist, is in the act of producing evidence. This image documents the very first cachette that was excavated of Deir Bahari in 1881. And it shows how photography is really embedded in the history of archaeology, and how the role of the photograph is really cannot be dismissed when talking and reflecting about archaeological practices and the context in which, of course, the colonial context in which this field emerged. The reason why I start with this is, as I said, this presentation is kind of like the origin story of the film that I will show. So it starts with my research that I did during my studies at Leiden University. I did there research that I, like a thesis that I called They Were Also Humans, on the dehumanizing nature of photographic and filmic portrayals of Egyptian mummies. So that this was my hypothesis, right? I wanted to study how Egyptian mummies were photographed in non-fictional images by archaeologists and museum curators and so on, and how they are portrayed in fictional terms in films such as the genre, the mummy monster genre. So the research was divided into these two areas, and the first one here you see stills from the film essay that I did in exploring how the ancient Egyptians are imagined in cinema in this long history of films. They don't even start with 1932, the very first The Mummy movie, but even earlier with these theatrical representations of how the fear of the past haunting the present is formulated in these fictional narratives, and that the mummified body becomes a monster, becomes an uncontrollable creature that oftentimes in these narratives, almost always the Western archaeologist with the tools of science and knowledge, the ability to read, becomes able to subdue the threat of the past and control it. So this was the film essay, which we can talk about in another incident, but now I want to focus on the photo essay that I did for this thesis. So I started looking at the photographic portrayals that were created of the ancient Egyptians, looking at how they have been photographed since the inclusion of the camera in the archaeological practice all until now. So I started collecting a lot of archival material from publications, museum catalogs, and contemporary and historical. And I started analyzing these images, how they are being portrayed. I put together this archive of photographs in the form of a visual essay. I called it At Last I Hold Your Gaze. And in this very first form of it, it was about identifying the patterns in portrayals. The reason why I was doing this research was reflecting on my own experience, thinking about what does it mean to go and visit my ancestors in museums after having seen their fictional portrayals in television, but also seeing their truthful portraits, truthful photographic portraits in news articles or in the media. So the way that my analysis went was I identified these patterns that mostly show how the human body in this situation, in this archaeological context, is oftentimes treated as an artifact, as an object. So there is no differentiation between photographing a pot, a coffin, or a human body. And I divided these images in 5 different chapters. The first one looked at how mummified bodies are being propped up, or have been often propped up against a backdrop, isolated and decontextualized and photographed to show the full specimen. In other instances, in like the second chapter of this essay is called You Cast Us All in the Same Mold. So how the forensic aesthetic is being used when photographing these side view, left and right, top and, this kind of almost like mug shots of the ancient Egyptians, how this continues to be a way of photographing them even now when we see images from new excavations. There is also a chapter on how mummified children are photographed interestingly in a different way, laying down on the scientifically led, scientifically covered with cloth table kind of approach, often with tools and artifacts around the body. Yeah, the remaining two chapters looked at the way that isolated body parts are photographed. For example, the skull, the limb, the hand. So with each one of these chapters, I was really, I was finding it very difficult to deal with this material, to think about what does it mean to have this medical gaze projected onto the mummified young children. What does it mean to see a mummified head held by hands with blue gloves to be measured, to be studied? And I wrote with each one of these chapters a monologue, imagining what it's like if that person being examined could look back at the archaeologist. So I was imagining this encounter between the two of them. What would the person say in the mummified, the deceased person, say if they knew or could witness how they have been handled by the archaeologists slash scientists slash medical personnel. So this was the very first form of that project. And again, if we look back at what I was saying about the violence of seeing, I felt myself unable to reproduce these images, hence in the previous slide how small they are on the screen. And I started thinking of ways that I could intervene with the photograph so that I wouldn't duplicate the violence in this representation. So I started covering the images, covering the unwrapped body parts with linen digitally. Then I printed the images, wanted to cover them even more. So I brought sand that I brought from Egypt, sand, and I started covering these prints and re-photographed them. And in this way, I also hint at other potential ways of treating not just the physical photograph, but treating the person. And in a way, it's a critique on how the person photographed becomes an object. But if I could at least show some empathy towards the photographic object, maybe that could hint at the possibility of showing empathy and care for the person depicted themselves. So yeah, as I mentioned, I wrote these monologues, and I will read a couple of them for you. You disturbed my eternal slumber. You carried me out of my chamber. You shipped me off on a sailing boat and placed me in your bustling establishment. There I met your camera's lens for the first time. You laid me on the marble floor and slowly set your recording apparatus to face my ancient figure. You dedicated your time to carefully examine my body. No longer sacred, it became the object of your study. You did not spare my child. How difficult it was to see you finding him. You opened his coffin after I had tucked it away decades ago. The agony I felt when you held the child I mourned for so long. My heart ached when I saw you taking off the wrappings that I rolled around him in tears. If only I could rush towards him, cover him with my own linen, and bury him once again. Oh, the sorrowful sight of his fragile body, lying in front of you, bare and naked. To then work with these images and these monologues and put them in the form of a book, I felt that I wanted to, as a book designer, I wanted to communicate this invasiveness of the act of seeing, and mirror it by making the person who would hold that book and how they would need to actually cut open a layer of linen that I wrapped around the book. So wrapping wrapping the book in linen becomes an invitation for the person about to open the book to actually have to cut it. And especially if you buy a new book, you wouldn't want to damage it, and then there is this tension. But it becomes a small hint at what it must have felt to be an archaeologist early on in the early years of archaeology, and use scissors to cut open the linen around a mummified person. So in this book form, I bring together these images and texts, and recently for an exhibition that is currently on at the Royal Museums of Art and History in Brussels, I explored another approach, this time inspired by daguerreotypes. So the act of photographing deceased people has not been only practiced within the archaeological realm, especially in Victorian times. There was a desire to keep memento mori, so reminders of the inevitability of death, but also mourning as a form of mourning the passing of loved ones. So a lot of people who were able to get the means to have their deceased loved ones photographed by studio photographers, and then they would enclose these images inside of book leather cases, usually small in size, like pocket size, and as a way to remember the loved ones. So I wanted to adopt this form, and I designed these small cases where the photographs of the ancient Egyptians would be enclosed. So it's a different way of presenting, and also another obstacle. So you cannot just put these images on a wall. They are really enclosed to create this intimate experience, also with including locks of hair or dried flowers that were loved by that person. You have this personification, this humanness that we often don't think of when we are dealing with ancient Egyptians in general. So during that project, there was the chapter that I mentioned where I looked at how the mummified heads are being handled and photographed by archaeologists. I have to say that there is in general desensitization towards these imagery. I'm sorry if they are triggering to some of the audience, and I hope if it's too triggering, people could just make the opt out and choose not to look at these slides. It's really interesting to see what kind of imagery we can look online and see in newspapers, what is allowed in relation to the ancient Egyptians. And this photograph is really accessible online, and it's one of the images that I came across when researching for my project, for my research on how the ancient Egyptians are photographed. And this is Tutankhamun, one of the researchers or art historians that really inspired my work on Tutankhamun is Christina Ricks, and she wrote extensively on the photographic archive that was created during the archaeological work of Howard Carter and the team of excavators there, medical team and so on, and how these photographs offer insights onto how the power dynamic in this historical moment was in balance, how photography can give us insights into that event. And last year, and at the end of 2022, I was invited to respond to the centenary, and that's when I thought of the work At Last I Hold Your Gaze, and that chapter and that photograph. And I wanted to think really carefully about what my contribution could be in relation to the incredible amount of content created around Tutankhamun. At that time, and I think there are still exhibitions running, there were several events and exhibitions offering new interpretations of that archive of photographs, looking at the Egyptian labor that was not given enough credit, that challenges, like that challenges the dominant narrative of this Western hero, the archaeologist who discovered that tomb. And then there are all these small alternative narratives that look at how the tomb was discovered, how the labor was performed, and who participated, and all the different uncredited, unnamed Egyptians that played an important role. Within that context, I felt I felt the need to really think about what could I add in this conversation, and I thought about well, the person at the center of it all, Tutankhamun. This voice is really not that dominant, not that present. We don't know how did Tutankhamun experience this event, and there is no way to know that. But if listening here as an approach could be about imagining the feeling of that person, what it must have been like to be in that tomb and have this very first encounter with archaeologists. That's where my starting point was, and I started looking at the material, the online documentation on the Griffith Institute's website, looking at the journals and the entries that were written by the main account, the main voice of this event is the voice of Howard Carter, and especially that Howard Carter kept a really meticulous, detailed journal. So I started studying this journal and thinking about how can I offer an alternative perspective. It's all in there, but what if I could just offer a retelling of these events from the perspective of Tutankhamun. Of course, there is again the gold that really takes over the whole discovery, and again with seeing and the problems of seeing. The gold really makes us stop at the surface. We really, when we think of Tutankhamun, all of the imagery are gold-plated, golden, shiny, wonderful, marvelous things. So if just looking at the role of the mask in the media, and really makes it almost impossible to think of Tutankhamun without staying at the surface of his mask. So with that in mind, I wanted to really be minimal in what I show in my work. I titled this piece, I prayed for the resin not to melt. The resin is a reference to something in Howard Carter's journals, especially that the body of Tutankhamun inside of the coffin was very difficult to remove, and it was one of the challenges that the archaeologist was facing, because there was this resin, this melted resin that kept the body stuck in the coffin. So that just making this this connection between the material, keeping in the middle between Tutankhamun and Howard Carter was one way of entering the story and offering an alternative reading. So I will leave you now to the film, and I thank you already for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, you have warned me that it will be difficult to start a conversation after the film, and it really is. I think I will just start with while all of you are hopefully collecting your own thoughts. I will just start with my own ideas of why I wanted to bring this work here and just open up one more channel for it to be seen. It is because I believe that ancient Egyptian culture and the ancient Egyptian frame of mind is only seemingly accessible. And in fact, it is quite difficult to understand from a 21st century perspective. And while you can walk into basically any large museums around the world, and you will find Egyptian objects, but you will also find that the ideas that are generally associated with these objects and are perpetuated by museum exhibitions and maybe popular publications and, well, pop culture in general, those are a sense of secrecy and the exotic and magic, and of course the idea of the archaeological adventure. And it is quite rare that ancient Egyptians are actually given a voice to go with all their mute objects. And this is in a way funny because we have an overwhelming abundance of textual sources to rely on. And Tutankhamun is really a case in point, because as you showed the images from the internet, the mask is probably one of the, or maybe the best, most well-known archaeological object on the planet. And but the circumstances of its retrieval that was brought to life in the film, those are not so well known. Also, everyone is familiar with the front of the mask, but not the inscription on its back, which you paraphrase in the film. It is an excerpt from the Book of the Dead. It is a spell that was meant to ensure that the head stays intact and that the facial functions are restored. And this is done by associating different parts of the funerary mask with different deities or different gods. And in the Book of the Dead, these words are originally spoken by the god Anubis. And he's actually talking to the mask itself. And I really like that in your version, Tutankhamun, well, in a somewhat desperate and very lonely attempt, takes over this role, and he recites the formula for himself, as if trying to defy this object-like nature that is generally associated with his body today. And well, as it says in the film, and as you know, his body now lies in his tomb, so it was placed back there, but it is a mutilated body and the tomb is empty. And all the wonderful things, to use Carter's term, are on display in the museum, and they are detached and decontextualized as museum objects generally are. And I think that what the inscription of the mask spells out is that funerary objects like this were not mere images, but they formed part of the otherworldly self of the deceased. And of course, this is not only true for Tutankhamun, but for all the masks and portraits that are now stored and displayed in museums and private collections even around the world. And also, ironically, what makes it possible for us now to understand what Tutankhamun stands for and what his mask and coffins and all the funerary objects stand for is in fact all the information retrieved from his tomb and then carefully documented and preserved by Howard Carter and his team and all those who later worked with this material up until Christina Riggs most recently. And so I think that is a bit of a paradox for me, at least here. So my initial questions are, well, maybe to what extent can we justify our treatment of the remains and the objects of the long dead in the name of science? And whether you can say if there is really an expiration date, so to say, on funerary equipment and human remains, after which maybe it is okay to treat them as archaeological objects. And if there isn't, which I believe there isn't, then how can we compensate for what we are doing? And what is our, and by our and we, I mean researchers, museologists, excavators, what is our responsibility in maybe trying to influence or inform the public about these issues? And I do not have the answers, but luckily we have also Kata Jasper with us. And I think I will turn to her first. You are active as a field archaeologist. And I wanted to ask you if what your own views are concerning these questions, and also your own experiences of how you deal with this at an excavation.
Thank you, Kata. And also thank you, Sara, very much for the presentation and for playing this short movie for us. Thank you very much. I confess that the thing that was most touching for me in the film was the sentence when Tutankhamun said that after his replacement in the tomb, that after that you left me alone in my empty tomb, or something like that. And I confess that I never realized that actually this is what happened, that all the objects that surrounded him for I don't know how many millennia were just taken away from the tomb, except for really one of the coffins and the sarcophagus. And what I recall, and well, from this point of view, so I also won't have answers, but from another point, from the point of view of science, for me, those information that are gained from these objects are super important to think that I get closer to understand the way of thinking of a nation civilization that never or no longer exists. But the other thing that I recalled is an event that happened in 2009 during the last days of the excavation that we did in the Theban necropolis in Sheikh Abdal Gurna, because that time we were really just a couple of days before closing the tomb, and we were excavating in the forecourt of TT66. And we just found the entrance of a soft tomb, which was covered by sand, and we found heaps of human remains, actually. So they were really heaped up and left upon each other when we found them, and they were found at the entrance or one of the intercolumniums of the Saf tomb, and we had to do something with these human remains because we could not leave them out for the other season. I mean, leave them out in the sun for a whole year, and we removed them. We brought all of them to another tomb, and it turned out that these mummies, these human remains, these skeletons, were actually pulled out of their coffins, not or partly by early 20th century explorers of the tomb, but partly before the, let's say, scientific excavation or the first scientific excavation of the tomb. So they were taken by tomb robbers, either in ancient times or in more modern times, but before archaeological excavations actually took place in that area. And so the human remains were put, yes, into wooden boxes and covered and brought to the shady TT65, the major tomb of our concession area, and they were kept there for a couple of years till the anthropologists came and investigated them. And it turned out that, well, actually, and they were not in a good state of, they were not in a good state. So they were scattered, the bones were scattered all around the area. And it is thanks to the scientific investigation that they were actually, the individuals were put back put back to, so that they were collected and grouped together. We gained a lot of information about them, and they were all registered and so really scientifically studied. And then they were actually, we tried to place the human remains, but in that case, not to their original burial place, because the tomb is still not cleaned entirely, but they are placed other areas of other burial chambers. But it also happened that, for example, during the cleaning of shaft tomb that is located in the is located in the transverse hall of TT67, that after the clearance of the shaft and after the study of the human remains, they are just covered by linen and taken back to their original burial place. And this is the moment that I recall that well, actually we really put them back to where they were resting for millennia. But it's true that we put them back without the objects that they were surrounded with, or these objects are already removed from that area. And even in this particular case, they were already disturbed before the actual archaeologists arrived. So this is what I recalled while watching your movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's no way to answer these questions, and there is, I think, I understand the importance of knowledge, right? And the gained information that we have like collected through these excavations and through the archaeological field in general, there will always be merit in these justifications, right? It's just that I think it's really important to always ask these questions, these difficult questions, and to rethink the practices, because I think already, for instance, there are a lot of what we call now non-invasive techniques, and my role as an artist is to challenge these as well, and to push the conversation forward, so that even though, for example, X-rays are considered non-invasive ways of seeing, it's still very, for example, harmful to the eyes to be able to see. Like, what does it mean to see through? And in the case of the reburial of excavated human remains, it's really interesting to hear your retelling of that specific case, where you had to bring back these, you had to recreate the person in order to have them as an individual again, and then undo the harm done by tomb robbers, but also realizing that the tomb is no longer the tomb, and what is a tomb without the objects within it, especially that we can read what they, like Kata was saying, that these objects had significant meanings and roles for the soul of that person. So bringing Tutankhamun back to an empty tomb is not reburying his body. Is just making a touristic site out of his tomb. It's you know, I think there are we're not there yet where we know when to stop. But it's really important to keep asking that. Yeah.
Sure. And what is important is that I was wondering whether in each and every time that I had, no matter what kind of human remains in my hands, whether I thought about it as a human or as an object, and that's true. That not, but quite often it happened that it was just an object for me. So from this point of view, it was also important for me and stimulating to watch your movie. But the other thing that I find touching and interesting is seeing our how to say, the Egyptian people that are working with us, because they were the ones that did the actual burial. So they were the ones who placed the bodies into the tombs, and they treated them with the greatest respect, really. So it was really nice to see.
Yeah, I think it's very. I think it's very interesting when you reflect on how you perceive the human remains as objects, as artifacts, right? And it's part of the job, right? Like the medical gaze is to, in order to help someone to be a surgeon, you cannot just, you know, have this connection, or and it's part of the field that you need to have this distance, but that's. This way of understanding is part of what has been handed down to us, and I think there must be other ways for an archaeologist to relate to the human body in a different way, and to rethink whether how to treat. Okay, maybe first, like, is there a need to treat human remains, and to still be in touch with actual bones, and if there is this need, then how can they be clearly treated in a very different way than the other objects in the tomb. And then it's not the turning them into artifacts, but to always maintain their dignity as humans. So there must be ways of challenging that, even though the practices demand this, but practices can always change and be rethought. I think.
That's true. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering that, but not wondering, but just wanted to add that it's really challenging to figure out how to treat human remains differently, but we try really to keep them separate from other finds. We try to cover them as well as we can until they are studied. And even in the last article that came up 2 years ago on human remains from this particular area, our anthropologist Robert Stark could prove or identify a very rare disease that is very rarely proven from ancient Egypt or from ancient times through or thanks to the study of one particular skeleton. So it's the other side of the same coin, that we have really important pieces of information.
I would like to open up the floor for, so I'm just saying this to everyone, please feel free to join the discussion, and you can just use Zoom's raise hand feature or tool, or just type in the chat, so whatever is comfortable for you, but we are looking forward to questions and insights and ideas from all of you, so feel free. Okay, yeah, maybe Zita first, I think. Yeah. I'm not sure if you are talking already, but we cannot hear you. Okay, maybe we can cut to Alir, and then get back to Zita. Maybe it will work a bit shortly. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you so much for the screening and for the introductory lecture to it. I really enjoyed it. I have a question for Sara, if that's okay. And I really love how your work is really raising so many questions, and it's becoming more and more accessible to many Egyptologists, and we are looking at this material from different perspectives. I was wondering if you could tell us how the work has been received by Egyptian colleagues and what their particular insights about this video that you have showed us today are.
By Egyptian colleagues, you mean working in the field or of archaeology, or Egyptian public in general? Like
I meant both. If you could tell us about both, that would be great.
It's okay. Thank you for your question. I think it's really, it's difficult, of course. Like, I cannot summarize or like give one voice to everyone who've watched the video or their responses. I think what I found really consistent is that a lot of practitioners in the field find that that work really unsettling, and I've shown it in multiple occasions where it was usually followed by this silence and this discomfort, because it was described as this very embodied, almost like a rape situation. So I think the reception of that work really, really makes people who are working in that field question, right? Like question the extent that they could do something different or not, because there is it's like Kata Jasper was talking, like it's very difficult to, like, you try to be respectful and to be mindful, but is that enough? It's not easy. It's not an easy answer. And I think with an Egyptian public, I think people that I've shown the work to, I think the general comment would be in response to my work in general, how the question often is, how can we as Egyptians always have pride to consider the ancient Egyptians our ancestors, and yet we don't perceive them as grandparents and great-grandparents, and we treat them in a very peculiar, specific way. A lot of Egyptians are involved in tourism, are involved in these locations where the cemetery slash tomb slash touristic site slash archaeological workspace is all one. So I think I try to make this bridge between the personal, the intimate, and the collective, this impersonal space come together. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a difficult work that people respond to in a very low-key way, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't know, Zita, maybe we can try again. I don't know if you're still here, but well, okay. Anyone else with questions or comments to Sara? Okay, while you are thinking, okay, yeah, it's good to type. Yeah, please do.
May I have a question till Zita is?
Yeah, sure.
To Sara, because I forgot to ask it, and now it. So you said that taking or the photographing the mummified bodies. I mean that you disagreed the matter how they did it, or the way they did it. So what would be a more human way of taking pictures of the mummies, if it exists? I know that you said that you prefer raising questions than giving answers, but it just really came to my mind that, okay, if not that way as treating them as objects, but what would be more human?
Yeah, I think Yeah, I think it's a really a good question. Thank you. I think it's part of the nature of the photograph to create objects, and the medium itself freezes the person, creates this frozen moment, and there is a lot of theory about the act of photographing as an inevitable way of creating artifacts. And so I think again, I don't know how to use a medium that inherently creates this problem. How can we still use it as a way of representation? But I think through my work, I try to challenge so for example, I try to intervene with the photographs. I try to make them act against their for instance, to cover the photograph of Tutankhamun by linen, and to prevent us from seeing the photo bit by bit. It's a kind of commentary on the inevitability of having the photo, and the challenge of not seeing. In our world, we need to see. That's just the human nature. So there is no way out of the photographic representation. But I think having a better understanding of that medium and the problematics of the power imbalance between the photographer and the subject, and how there's always this act of shooting. Like there is a lot of in that dynamic. There is a lot to explore and to be critical of. And I think before we can imagine new ways of photographing, we need to be really aware of what it means to photograph as just another way of documentation. Again, no clear answer on that, but I hope that is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have the question from Zita, and she says, I was wondering that we saw an invasive version of the events from the perspective of Tutankhamun, who was forcefully taken from his tomb. What about the type of people we heard about, who are not in their original tombs, who could maybe find more peace after being found by modern researchers? Would they be the flip side of things? Could they maybe be a bit happier by being found and remembered when compared to being in pieces and forgotten?
Really, really nice question. I think we perhaps thinking of Tutankhamun as a standalone example for every other ancient Egyptian is not the right way to talk about this. And I think it's really important to remember that they are individuals, each one with a story, each one with a situation. And I think Zita brings to our attention that indeed the act of putting together an already violated body, and having the archaeologist mend that violence by bringing the body back together, and potentially reburying that person in another tomb, because they were not in any tomb. Like Kata's story is indeed a human sensitive way of treating that person, and not all. The one story does not work on each and every individual. So I think indeed the intervention of an archaeologist in this case would be justifiable to think about the peace and the rest that this person would not have had if they would left violated by previous tomb robbers.
Okay, thank you. In the meanwhile, we have one more question from Guilherme. Sorry about the pronunciation. Good afternoon. Says, apologies for not being able to turn my current mic on. Thank you for sharing such pertinent and thought-provoking film with us, Sarah. I just wanted to ask, out of curiosity, was English the first or single option for the language of the work, or did you consider doing it in Arabic, or even asking an Egyptologist to read the Book of the Dead spell in the original?
Really nice question. Thank you. I think, this question is something that runs throughout my work. I make works in English, even though I'm an Arabic speaker, and regardless of the actual language of in this case of Tutankhamun's language, I think I'm in the continuous process of thinking about my own internalization of this Western approach to my own studies, my own work. So I think I'm a product myself of this of this colonial culture. I mean, I studied in English. I had mentors from European mentors. I am living abroad, not in Egypt. So I shouldn't be defensive. I'm not defensive. This is, I think, something that is confrontational for me, that I am really trying to learn and question my own unconscious choices. And in that case, indeed, to think of Tutankhamun as an English speaker is not reflective of especially it's the language of Howard Carter in that situation. So I think it's a really good question, and I unfortunately still make the choice of addressing a larger public by making my work in English, even though that means it's not accessible to a lot of people, and it's not representative to the especially in works where I try to represent other voices. So yeah, if there is an Egyptologist who would like to render my work of this film into a hieroglyphic language, spoken language, that would be a really good collaboration that I'm totally open for.
It is also impossible.
Yeah.
May I just tune in with one more question? I think that maybe I'm right to say that your work has received quite a lot of attention, and this partly goes back to actually Tutankhamun. So it was kind of triggered by the Tutankhamun centenary, and now you've been invited to many museums and events, and we've been talking about the archaeological excavations and how archaeologists treat human remains. But I think that there is this whole other field that is museums, where you have even less ground to justify the public display of mummies in the name of science. It is something kind of demanded by the public. And fortunately, I've never been in a situation where I had to make a decision about whether to display a mummy or not at an exhibition. But I do know that this is it is kind of a public pressure on many Egyptological collections. People want to see the mummies. And in your work with museums where you've been invited, do you feel that there is, or is there beginning to be a change in this museological discourse? Or is it still the norm? I think it still is the norm that if you walk into an exhibition of Egyptian antiquities, then you are expecting to see mummies.
Yeah, I think the presence of that discussion in itself is really dominant. I think a lot of museums are talking about that, at least a lot of museums that I have had the access to hear these conversations in. And I think it is, like you said, it's the public who demands it, and a lot of museums conduct surveys and ask the public about their opinions, and they try to sense whether, for instance, the recent change from not using the word mummies and using instead mummified human remains, is that like museums try to sense the pulse of the public and see what is no longer okay or yeah, politically correct. But I think it would be more interesting to think about museums as institutions that shape the public's opinion and train the public's habits. So instead of responding to the public's demand, one should think of the need for the need that people have to see mummies. It comes from that we as museum visitors have learned to expect to see mummies, to learn that this is where we would have our curious eyes satisfied. And of course, there is a lot to learn from this encounter, and it depends really on the context, how it is presented. But there's also a lot of problems in that encounter, and especially that people are not landing in museums without any previous knowledge. There is a lot of other imagery and other representations, problematic and problematic interpretations of let's say the mummy monster, for example. This culture doesn't stop at the door of the museum. People carry that with them, and especially museum stores that sell mummy monster figures or playful things to children. It's all embedded, and I think even the archaeological gaze that we were talking about becomes a public gaze because the photographic work of archaeologists becomes consumed by the public, who then meet human remains in the museum. So it's not separate. All these institutions are really connected, and I think, yeah, museums could take more risks. I think should take
more. Well, I agree, but of course it is something easier said than done in most of the cases.
And I'm in a privileged situation where I can my opinion and my criticism and try to steer these questions. But I understand the difficulty. I'm not proposing solutions. I think what I try to achieve with my work is to really poke and invite people to think along and to participate in that critical discourse, so that people are challenged in their work behavior and could create better choices or better situations. I think.
Yeah, I think that could be one way to go ahead, obviously, and that's why I wanted to invite you so much, because it just shows another way of thinking, and it could be and it is embraced perhaps by museums. So just giving the possibility to see this side as well, I think would be nice, and just giving voices in all kinds of levels and layers. is a good idea, probably.
I think this is really something that a lot of museums are considering, this diversifying the voice, not just having the institution voice as the one that is leading the museum experience. I think there is some light.
Yeah, let's hope so. Any more questions or comments from our audience? There's something in the chat. Just a thank you. Well, maybe. Okay, this is a long one. I'll read it out. It's from Christina Fiegler. First of all, I would like to also thank you very much for this inspiring film and your thoughts. We should open this conversation towards archaeologists in general, not only Egyptologists. In 2022, a tomb of a Roman doctor was excavated in Hungary. He was buried with his complete medical equipment, so it is a very important and exciting discovery. Some weeks ago, a press conference was held about it, and several articles and TV spots, etc., were presented. You can see a photo attached about the press conference. I think this is quite a similar situation, the dehumanization of a human body. How can I show an image? I don't know. Maybe, Krista, you need to share your screen.
Or to drop it in the chat, I think.
Or drop it in the chat, yeah. Yeah, some of you may have seen this image. It was big news. Okay, she's trying in Hungary.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I even mentioned this to you, Sarah, earlier. Yeah, okay. Well, it's a link that I think I'm inviting everyone to click, but I don't think I can make it visible right here.
No, yeah, I see.
Yeah, it would lead me away. But what you need to imagine is it's really a press conference with many people, and the body, it's a skeleton, was actually laid out on a kind of a bier. And it was set up as if it was the moment of discovery. So it was placed on kind of gravels or sand, and then the implements were around him. And this happened during the press conference, and one actually had the feeling that this was inviting attention through the human remains, and as if the archaeological discovery in itself, which was pretty fascinating, was not enough, but you did need the mummy itself. I mean, sorry, the skeleton itself to go with it.
Yeah, I think the dehumanization of a human body, like Christina is saying, I think there is another element to it, the spectacleization, like the creation of the spectacle, right? Is really a part of something like this press conference, right? It's to create this spectacle, and what else could be more of a spectacle than such a sight? I think it makes me think of the thesis that I wrote, and how it's not a practice that has stopped it. We still reproduce the same imagery, and this is probably similar to what a Victorian party, where they would unwrap a human body together in the drawing room, or whatever it was called. This kind of experience is really something that has changed in nature, but still has a lot of presence. So it's difficult to look at this photo, and it's difficult to know that it's not difficult to look at that photo and to attend such an event, and to actually expect this, and then people trying to make their decisions in relation to these expectations. So it's really I find it fascinating to really think about what is allowed and what is not allowed to do, and if that skeleton was not a Roman skeleton, but I don't know, 100 years old, or that it's a very different conversation. People respond very differently. So yeah, I think the relevance of what I was analyzing from the early cachette is still timely, I think. I have a thought. I think Lyra, who asked the question, I'm not 100% sure, but I think she may have been the organizer, one of the organizers of that event that I presented this work. Right? Yes, yes, yes. Because that was the very first symposium that I showed this work for in 2022, and it was mainly an archaeological audience seeing that work for the very first time. So thank you, Lyra. I wasn't sure, but yeah, you had the premiere, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Any more questions or comments? Last chance, I think, to raise your hands or type in. Well, if not, then I think I will just thank you, Sara, again for coming and showing your film. And I hope that all of you can leave with some more insight into this field and food for thought. And I hope that this discussion can continue in the future.
So too, thank you so much, Kata, for the invitation, and thank you, Kata, for your insights on the excavation. And I really hope that we do continue this conversation and thinking together, and finding new ways of dealing with this difficult topic.
Let's do that. Thank you, Sara, again.
Thank you very
And
much.
thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.